What's up, informed mystics? Welcome back to the High Priestess and the Hierophant. I say that word different every time I say it. Today we have Daina with us. Her channel on YouTube is TheShadowMoonWitch. She is also on Instagram, and we will, of course, leave her links below. As usual, we are your co-hosts. I am Drew. This is Erika. And we thought we would have Daina on today to talk a little bit about the recording process. Erika, you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. First, I want to say the actual correct pronunciation is Hierophant, but people say Hierophant all the time.
I say both. I say both.
You can say it either way. I think, in the initial series of videos we're making, we're talking about foundational aspects of having a mystical practice. And I think that what we do with the mystical experience once we have it is, a natural progression on the conversations we've had previously. And the first thing that we do, or the first thing we thought of when we thought about that, was writing down our experience or recording our experience in some way. It doesn't have to be actually writing it down. So I think this is an important video, because if you're building a practice, you want to strive to make a record of the experiences you have.
And we haven't really touched on our personal past overly much. I mean, we've mentioned that we are polytheistic and that we're pagan. Daina is also the same, for anyone who doesn't know. We consider ourselves, Erika and I, to be mystics. And I don't know that Daina considers herself to be a mystic, but I think that she would agree that she has had mystical experiences and that it is part of her path and her practice.
The first question is about the importance of recording mystical experience, and for each of us to talk about where we stand on how important it is to record mystical experience and why it's important or not.
So Daina, if you want to start, we'll start with you.
First of all, it's just how I've always been. I mean, I love to journal and stuff as a creative outlet, as a mental outlet. So I just naturally progressed to that when I started to go on this path, which started initially with Wicca. For me, I think it's just important to look back on my development and to have a reference, not to mention the fact that, I'm a neurodivergent person, and sometimes just having all of that up in here just does me no good. And so I need a place to keep all of it. And I tend to compartmentalize because it helps keep me more together. But the other thing that I wanted to mention just specifically for my path on its own is that being a Norse pagan, historically, those traditions were oral, passed down from family to family, generation to generation. And so what we have of Norse mythology and its history is not a whole lot. And I just wish that there was more. So I like contributing to that in my own way, in my own path, and knowing that I'm contributing more.
Yeah, no, that resonates with me, because the Celtic pagan path, the same can be said that prior to Christians coming to Celtic lands, there was an oral tradition of recording the Druid practices and other spiritual practices. So, and primarily the Druids created triads where they were sayings that helped them memorize important spiritual insight. So I think, like Daina, looking at it through that lens of, the neo-Celtic pagan tradition, the importance of recording that tradition in terms of preserving our experience, our individual experience within the tradition, because we're not dogmatic, we're pagan, so we don't have church leadership like churches or, any Abrahamic kind of traditions would. We don't have, I shouldn't say church, but we don't have ecclesiastical, leadership to record that and keep it in a record. So it falls upon the individual to preserve their experiences. And as Daina said, I think it helps you see, if you look back on what you've recorded, it helps you to see your progress and to see your growth on your spiritual path. But also from the point of view of mysticism, I think, the whole mystic experience is not linear. So we could have something come up, years before we actually have another experience that explains that or validates that or builds upon that. So it's really important for us. Like Daina said, some of us or most of us don't have a perfect memory, so we're not going to remember, and memory changes and shifts things. So, having that record, and for me, a challenge being able to catalog those records in a way I can find information readily is really helpful, because, you can't rely on your memory completely, especially when it comes to something important like remembering a detail of a mystical experience from 10 years before. And I've had those experiences where something from 10 years before was relevant and I needed to look back on it. So
yeah, well, and time is just a construct anyway. So yeah, obviously.
Exactly.
Yeah. The way we think about those things is very different than what actually is. Of course, as usual, my experience is a little different. Obviously, the path that I'm on right now is with Egyptian deity and Egyptian practice, Kemetic practice, Heka. So it's like there's so much information that, if you want to look at, especially into like really dry academic texts and books and whatnot, you can find all manner of information. However, that is not how my path began. My path began in the middle of basically nowhere. I didn't have any real solid group, if you will, or, historical, line to like follow at all. And so the core of my path is this mystical path of just me and spirit figuring this out on our own. And so like recording can be extremely important, I think, in that regard, because again, as you pointed out, Erika, you could write something down and then later on go back and be like, whoa, what was that? Not only that aspect of it is important for me, but also I have a tendency to further work through everything as I record it, whether that's through speaking it aloud or through writing it down. It gives me a chance to analyze it and to dig deeper into it and to maybe come to a deeper understanding of, or just going over it more than once in that way can shake something loose and have a thought that a color meant something that it was just a color. I hadn't even paid attention to that. You know what I mean? Something like that. So right. For me, those are reasons why it's important to record these experiences. No, along with everything that both of you said as well, too, actually.
So I would add to that I think for a lot of us, we're building our own practices primarily through the mystical experience and through personal gnosis. For those of us, like I said, who are on like a pagan path or a path where there isn't dogma, there isn't, a central organizing authority. So if we're building our own practice, essentially, even if it is heavily inspired from or connected to other spiritual communities that have you work with the similar deities or have similar beliefs, if we're building our own practice, we need to record stuff so we can take all of that data and pull from it themes and pull from it, the stuff we need to build it, like significant stuff we need to create a ritual or build a practice for a holiday. So, for those of us who are kind of in that realm where we're kind of essentially creating our own path, our own practice, it's really important. Yeah.
Agreed. Well, and then I guess the next thing we were going to talk about are some ways of recording. And obviously the first thing that comes to anybody's mind is journaling, but I have used my YouTube channel for that. And I think, Daina, you probably have as well. Mm-hmm. And then I was thinking about you, Erika, and blogging is definitely a way. You love to blog, and there are a lot of people who use blog in that way. And that's kind of like journaling, but it's not exactly the same. As well as coming together with community. Like, I share these experiences with you guys, for example. And I do think that is a form of documentation, at least with regards to how I use, like I was talking about having the outlet to work through it, and doing that with other people sometimes is immensely helpful.
Mm-hmm. The processing aspect because one of the reasons we record, like you mentioned, Drew, is to process experiences. So that can be done, in a group setting. It can be done in a, small or large informal or formal group setting. It could be done just by talking out loud to the broader community through, YouTube or, yeah, I used to do a blog where I did more of the spiritual stuff. Now it's focused on tarot, which is spiritual. But it definitely was something that served me well. I tend to primarily rely on journaling, and we can talk about the different types of, I guess you could say different types of journals, because some of the stuff that we as pagans do, like I said, we don't have a Bible. No matter which pagan tradition you're from, you might have some sacred texts that are from earlier civilizations or earlier groups that practiced and worked with the deity that you work with, but they're not modern. So some of the journals that we have, which we would call like a book of shadows or a grimoire, are more like creating your own, in my mind, your own version of like a Bible. It's like, kind of a how to follow your practice versus the journal, which we would call sometimes a book of mirrors, where you're journaling your experiences and you're doing that processing. So
I mostly wanted to kind of bounce off the idea of YouTube and using the community to bounce your ideas and to kind of have that echo chamber in a sense. That's primarily what I use my channel for. It's mostly if I want to process something that I'm mulling over in my head, most commonly on my channel, I will do these videos called Night Owl Rambles. And that's where I'm just up late at night and I have thoughts and I want to bring them to the community and get some other opinions on what's rattling around in my head. And that has been extremely helpful, but it's also a completely different process versus me journaling on my own, in my own private thoughts that are going to be kept just for me. Sometimes I will share things from my Book of Mirrors if I feel it's necessary, but the two are very different processes and they have very different purposes to me. So I don't know, I just kind of wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, that's kind of the third question. It's like, how effective are any of these, what purpose do they serve in your life, basically? And I kind of have the same thoughts. It's like, I love the YouTube way of sort of keeping records of these things because it's a way of processing. It's nice, like you said, to have that sort of back and forth on occasion with people and to kind of get maybe some different insight or just to hear a different perspective or some validation, what have you. But I'm not necessarily going to go back and watch my videos. I might if I feel like there's something in there for me, but it's a lot easier for me to go to one of the journals and to look at that and to be like, okay, to look back. It can be difficult, as we've talked about last time we chatted about this, Erika. You mentioned, sometimes the chronological order to like find what you're looking for can be difficult. And it would be nice if there was an easier way but even just mulling through it sometimes, I mean, looking back through an old journal and coming across something you weren't even looking for and it click and it be something meaningful, that happens and that's lovely. So I think that there are probably a lot of different ways that people could go about sort of recording their experiences, but each of them is going to sort of serve a different function. And that's sort of my experience of that.
Yeah, for sure. Like currently right now I have, in terms of my spiritual practice, I have right here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different books. I'll just show you guys. I have a poetry journal, which I consider part of my spiritual practice. I have like a mundane journal just to like for head noise or just to, process things that aren't necessarily spiritual, but I think the act of journaling for me is spiritual, so I keep that there. And then I have journals for each of the deities I work with. This is one of them. And I have a tarot study / reading journal that has 2 different tarot study books that I'm working with and a journal to record my readings. So that's a lot. So you can imagine I have a box with, I've, been on this path actively doing this for, at this point, the box I have is probably 5 years worth of stuff that's specifically related to my pagan practice. So it's a lot of stuff. It's hard to find stuff, but
yeah, I have quite a bit too. The way I used to do it was different. So I have a lot of loose papers that are in binders, but I've I still, it's not as cut and dry for me. I'm kind of a messy person. I don't know, but like I'm one of those people that's kind of off in every direction. I'm not a very focused person. So only a few of my books are super focused on one thing. And then there's some of them that they're kind of, and that, like, I have one that I would just call a dumping ground, and like it just has any kind of thing in it. Usually if something spontaneous comes to me, I'll throw it in there. Whereas I have, ones that are very specific, like my grimoire for witchcraft, for example.
What about you, Daina? How many active kind of spiritual recording documents do you have now that are, like, I guess physical ones we're talking about versus, YouTube, that kind of thing?
I have started to digitally tarot journal too, just because I love being able to save on paper and be able to just take a picture of the card and put it in. Yeah. So I'm probably going to start doing that as I study Thoth and Marseille as well, when it comes to tarot specifically. So I do that on my iPad. But I have a book of shadows, which essentially, I don't keep spells or anything in here. It's seriously just information on my path specifically and some reference stuff, and sort of a creative outlet as a representation of myself as a pagan and a practicing witch. And then I have a goddess journal that I made that is specifically for the divine feminine and the goddesses that I work with. And this is the most recent one. This is just a journal that I grabbed to specifically study like Norse terms and the Norse path, because there's so much. As I've dived deeper into the Norse path, I'm like, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that term is, or I don't know much about that specific type of magic, or, so I wanted to have a place for that. And then I have a book of mirrors, which is basically, this is my brain dump for all things spiritual. This is where notes go for meditations. This is where notes go for if I have some thoughts that I want to record that I don't really want to share with anyone else, or if I just need to write down spell ideas or prayers or anything like that. This is where all that goes. And then I am working on a spell book, which is partially creative outlet, but also partially like this is where the final draft of spells go. It didn't feel right to keep them in my book of shadows. I just wanted a different place for it. So, but yeah, journaling for me is half an artistic thing and half a like analytical thing.
Yeah, some of your journals are really beautiful. You've shared some of the art in them. And I have, I guess I had a little bit of that going on, and I've kind of leaned more in, because the poetry is more written, but, and we can, when we're on our Patreon video, we'll maybe share some sneak peeks of what's inside of our journals. Were you going to say something, Drew?
Everybody else showed theirs, so I guess I'll show mine. This is my grimoire. So, this is witchcraft up to 2019. Well, up to 2020 anyway. But it's got there's tarot spreads and there's all kinds of stuff in there. Anyway, it's more reflective of my path as it was than as it is at this point. There's this. What is this? This is. So I write down meditations and sometimes astral work in this it's just like a little composition notebook that's pretty. This is my brain dump. Everything. There's so much stuff in here, stuff about working different energy, casting circle, recycling magic, just all kinds of stuff in there.
Does anybody else wish they had a glass of wine so they could read everybody else's stuff and learn? Just sit there with a glass of wine and...
This I record dreams in. There's not much in there because I find, for me personally, I go through cycles. I will have a cycle of time where I have mystical dreams or dream messages and stuff, whatnot. But then I have long, long cycles where it's just, I either don't remember or it's just nothing. It's just me working through my day.
Too. Mm-hmm. It must be astrological or something.
For me, it's heavily astrological. Yeah. It depends on what's going on.
I think it also depends on what's going on in my path. If I'm in a really intense time of growth and development, then this is what I call my book of echoes and reflections. And basically, anytime I did a spell, it got written down in here. Now, I don't do spells the way I used to, so I don't know what's going to happen with that. But This composition notebook is my most important one. Actually, it's the most plain, but it's the most important. This is where I keep track of all of my readings that I do with my oracle deck with Ost and Egyptian deity. Stuff in here is like things that I'm actively working on at any given time. And these two go together. There's this and there's this. This is my book of Heka, is what I call it. And it's a place where I keep everything about my path thus far with Cometics and Heka and, you know, the Egyptian deity. And this is just sort of a dumping ground for anything I feel like I need to write down, I write down in here. And then later I can go back and put it in this one and make it look pretty and have it be organized in the right section and, you know, all that good stuff. So, because this one is for reference as well. Whereas this is just like a place where I can get it down so I don't forget or whatever. And I have more, honestly, but those are the ones that are specific and important.
Yeah, and that's a good point to have. Like, there's a theme of having ones where you're just kind of like throwing all the, you know, chaotic kind of random stuff that comes through, and then there's another one where you filter and process that and put it all in there in a way that can be a reference. So
right.
That's almost like the Book of Mirrors versus the Book of Shadows in a more kind of Wiccan or, you know, traditional witchcraft. Well, maybe not traditional witchcraft, but witchcraft, conventional, kind of popular. So mine's a little bit different because my practice is different, but I don't know. I just love all that physical journals. It just like makes me happy seeing all your journals. They're so pretty. So yeah, in terms of like the third question, in terms of like the effectiveness of methods, like I love listening to what you guys were saying because I think that that's like, I didn't bring out Big Bertha. You guys know what I'm talking about. I have this giant Book of Shadows that I created early on in my path where I was, you know, trying to follow more of that, you know, like Wiccan kind of approach. And it's kind of, I've kind of sidebarred it for now and it may not come back, but I feel like that's something that would be helpful for me if I maybe had a different version of something like that was the formal book that maybe was more, you know, artistic, that had the final product stuff in it. Because I have a lot of the brain dump stuff, but not as much of the, well, some, which I'll show in the Patreon video, but.
Well, and I would say, and I think this is mirrored in Daina with her Norse book probably, but with my book of Heka, for example, like I have this one, like, again, that's the brain dump, or, you know, whatever. It has so much stuff. I'm not going to put everything that's in here in my book of Heka. Somebody, if they wanted, at some point would be able to take my book of Heka and build their own practice around it. This would be a confusing, jumbled mess of whatever, right? But like, that's more like you were talking about the Bible. It's more like, it's like an instruction manual to an extent. I mean, I do have a section in there for personal stuff, like the beautiful dream I had about Ost, for example. But like, a good part of it is going to be information about working with the specific deity. And again, like terms that I didn't know what they meant, or practices that I didn't know what they were, about the holidays and the festivals and stuff like that.
Yeah, I did that with my, my book for Danu. I did more of that, but then the ones for the other two deities started as journals. So I kind of tried to do both in one book, which I think moving forward as I evolve, I may need to rethink that. But yeah, the problem, that's one piece of advice I would give people. Don't get the giant sketchbook that has 1,000 pages that looks like, you know, the book from, what's that show? The Charmed book. Because I went for that. I went full in, and then later I was like, this is so overwhelming. Like, and my path changed, and it just did. And now, like, it's good to have the previous stuff in there, but I've still got half an empty book, and I don't really know what to do with that. So I may hand it down to my kids and see if they want it, if one of them's interested. Hopefully at least one of them is. Maybe not. If they want to add to it, then, you know, they could. I have to think about it, but it's sitting up there. I'm looking at it, like, staring down at me, like, why am I not part of the party? So, yeah, that's not effective for me, answering the third question. That's one piece of advice, I guess. Yeah.
Well, Daina, what about you? How do you feel about the difference between your journals and what they bring to your practice?
I really think being able to have a different space for everything. I mean, again, as I had mentioned, just that compartmentalizing is really, really helpful for my brain. I need to be able to have a space for specific things, and to be able to have the freedom to have a brain dump. too, because it usually starts there and then it gets put in other places. But so really having that freedom, I think, helps me have that creative, expressive side. And then there's the other side of me that's very analytical and needs everything to have its place. And I'm an artist that can't do chaos. So like, I'm an artist that needs to have that space. So for me, that's been really beneficial. The other thing that has been really helpful and part of my advice that I would love to add to this is that don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to mess up a pretty journal. Don't be afraid to think that you can have more than one book of shadows or more than one beautiful book. And just don't be afraid to buy an awesome looking journal and then not use it. Just start using it and realize that it's going to be an expression of you and of your path. If your path changes, then it evolves with you. And that took me so long to get to that point. And it's amazing, truly, how long it took me. It was a good, 10 plus years where I finally was just like, oh, okay, I guess I can just go full on my journals and not care about messing up and realize that you can have more than one and you can do whatever works for you as long as it's conducive to your practice and how you function.
That's what I was going to say. That would be my advice. My advice is don't think it has to look like everybody else's or anybody else's. Like whatever, it's what works for you and the way that you feel most connected and the way that you're best able to express yourself, whatever that looks like. Because I've showed it on my channel. My grimoire is completely off the computer. Like I print it all out. Like there's no original artwork or anything in that. But because I need that to be something that I can read and I can reference and it looks pretty, I want to look at it, but it's just not chaotic at all. Whereas I would say my Book of Heka is a little bit more chaotic just because it's much more personal and I do my own artwork and stuff in it. So I think it's just about what you feel drawn to do, what makes you feel most connected to the project and what the purpose is, how that's going to serve you.
It's really good advice from both of you. I need it. It's always a work in progress.
I think we're actually coming to the end of this video, but we're going to hop over on Patreon, of course, and we're going to go a little deeper into our books, our personal experiences, and, on this topic of recording the mystical experience. So, if you're interested in that, of course, you could come over and check out our Patreon. Anything you ladies want to say before we go?
I need more coffee.
Okay, well.
Just keep exploring, as we say.
Yeah. Until next time, keep exploring.